The only people that I know who aren't are people who are unhappy in life and been a big disappointment to them.
There are deaths in Hollywood that the world sees coming. The slow unraveling, the public struggles, the warning signs that pile up like storm clouds before a flood. And then there are deaths that arrive without any warning at all, sudden, silent, and so completely out of nowhere that the people left behind spend years trying to make sense of what happened. Dan Blocker's death was the second kind. One morning he was a giant of American television, a man so physically commanding and spiritually warm that audiences genuinely could not imagine a world without him. By that same evening he was gone. Not from scandal. Not from a long illness. Not from anything the world could have seen coming. He was gone from a complication so quiet, so invisible, that it slipped past every doctor, every nurse, and every person who loved him. And the woman who loved him most, his wife Dolphia Parker Blocker, would spend the rest of her life in a grief so private and so dignified that history almost forgot she existed at all. This is the story of how Dan Blocker died, how his wife Dolphia carried that loss, and why their ending remains one of the quietest tragedies Hollywood has ever produced. To truly understand the weight of Dan Blocker's death, you first have to understand who he was. Not the character. Not the television icon. The actual man. Because the actual man was far more interesting, far more complex, and far more human than anything Bonanza ever put on screen. Dan Blocker was born on December 10, 1928, in DeKalb, Texas, arriving into the world at a staggering 14 pounds, a fact that sounds like the beginning of a tall tale but is entirely documented. He grew up in O'Donnell, a tiny West Texas town where Saturday nights were the main social event and where young Dan, already enormous by his teenage years, would sometimes step into roped-off sections of Main Street to take on any local man brave enough to challenge him. He never lost. He weighed somewhere around 275 pounds as a teenager and carried that size with a confidence that never once crossed into cruelty. What people tend to overlook when they think about Dan Blocker is how deeply intelligent he was. This was not a man who stumbled into acting because he had no other options. He earned a master's degree in dramatic arts. Before Bonanza ever existed, he was a schoolteacher, first teaching English and drama in Sonora, Texas, then 6th grade in New Mexico. He was working toward a doctorate at UCLA when television began pulling him in another direction. He was well-read, politically engaged, spiritually grounded in his Free Methodist faith, and thoughtful in ways that his giant frame and booming voice sometimes caused people to underestimate. When producer David Dortort cast him as Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza in 1959, Blocker brought all of that interior richness to a character who appeared, on the surface, to be simple. Hoss was big, gentle, slightly gullible, and endlessly kind, the emotional heart of the Cartwright family and, many would argue, the emotional heart of the entire show. What made Hoss work so completely was that Blocker never played him as a caricature. He played him as a real person, someone whose goodness came not from naivety but from a genuine and deeply held belief in human decency. That belief was not a performance. It came directly from Dan Blocker himself. Bonanza ran for 14 seasons. It became one of the most watched programs in American television history. By the mid-1960s, it was regularly ranked as the #1 show in the country. Dan Blocker was a genuine cultural phenomenon, recognized everywhere he went, beloved by children and adults alike, a fixture in millions of living rooms every Sunday night. And yet, by virtually every account from people who knew him well, fame made him uncomfortable. He did not enjoy being recognized in public. He did not enjoy strangers touching him or interrupting family moments. He valued privacy above almost everything else. He and Dolphia chose to raise their 4 children, twin daughters Deborah Lee and Dana Lynn, and sons David and Dirk, in a modest 4-bedroom home in Northridge, far from the Beverly Hills estates and Hollywood glamour that surrounded his professional world. In 1970, that desire for privacy led the Blocker family to make a decision so unusual for a television star of his stature that people immediately began speculating about hidden motivations. Dan and Dolphia relocated the family to Lugano, Switzerland. Not for tax purposes, not for any financial strategy. In fact, living abroad increased his tax burden considerably. They moved to Lugano because Dan had seen photographs of the lake region in a National Geographic magazine and had been captivated. They visited in 1970, and something about that quiet, mountain-ringed city felt right to him in a way that no American suburb ever quite had. In Lugano, Bonanza aired only in German, and in the Italian-speaking southern region of Switzerland where they lived, very few people watched it at all. Dan Blocker could walk down a street as an anonymous man. He was not Haas Cartwright there. He was just Dan. And for a man who had spent more than a decade struggling with the weight of celebrity, that anonymity was not a small thing. It was everything. His plan was practical. Whenever Bonanza required him in the United States, he would return. Whenever he had time between filming, he would fly back to Switzerland and be with his family. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it was the best compromise he could find between the career that had made him famous and the private life that kept him grounded. In 1972, Dan Blocker returned to the United States to begin work on what the production team had planned as another season of Bonanza. He was 43 years old. He had spent more than a decade playing one of television's most beloved characters, and despite the exhaustion that came with that kind of sustained professional commitment, there was no indication that his story was anywhere near its ending. He had his family settled in Switzerland. He had a career that showed no signs of slowing down. He had plans. But those around him noticed something. Blocker did not seem like himself. The energy that had always been one of his most defining qualities, the vitality that allowed a man his size to dominate a room without even trying, seemed diminished. He was tired in a way that went beyond ordinary fatigue. He was weak in a way that concerned the people who knew him well enough to see past his natural tendency to minimize physical complaints. He went to the hospital. The diagnosis was not dramatic. His gallbladder needed to be removed. A cholecystectomy, the surgical removal of the gallbladder, was then and remains today one of the most commonly performed elective surgeries in the United States. Tens of thousands of people undergo the procedure every single year and return home within a day or two without serious complications. There was nothing in Dan Blocker's presentation that suggested his case would be any different. He was a strong man who had survived combat in Korea, who had once fractured his own collarbone during a filming accident and, rather than going to the hospital, set the bone himself before climbing back onto the horse and finishing the scene. Compared to what he had already endured in his life, a gallbladder removal must have seemed almost trivial. The surgery was performed and appeared to go smoothly. Whatever pain and fatigue had been dragging at him for months seemed to be behind him. He was discharged from the hospital and sent home to rest and recover. He was optimistic. The people around him were relieved. The immediate crisis seemed to have passed, and attention turned toward his recovery timeline and when he might be back on set. Then, only hours after returning home, everything changed. Dan Blocker became dizzy. He complained of severe pain. The symptoms escalated quickly and frightened everyone who witnessed them. Dolphia, his wife, recognized immediately that something was seriously wrong. She rushed him back to the hospital. But by the time they arrived, the situation had already moved beyond what medicine could reverse. Dan Blocker died that same day. He was 43 years old. The cause was a pulmonary embolism. A blood clot, a deep vein thrombosis that had formed during or following his surgery, had traveled through his bloodstream and lodged in the pulmonary artery, blocking blood flow to his lungs. It is a complication that carries a devastatingly high mortality rate when it reaches the severity Blocker experienced. It is also, in many cases, nearly impossible to predict. In Dan Blocker's case, it did not announce itself at all until it was already too late. The date was May 13, 1972. A man who had spent more than a decade feeling permanent, to his family, to his cast, to millions of fans who tuned in every Sunday night, was simply gone. The news spread quickly, and the disbelief that followed was genuine and widespread. Dan Blocker was not the kind of man anyone expected to die young. He was too large, too vital, too deeply embedded in the cultural imagination as something permanent. Michael Landon, who had become one of Blocker's closest friends during their years together on the Bonanza set, was shattered. The two men had developed a bond that went well beyond professional respect. Blocker had served as best man at Landon's wedding. They had spent years working side by side, from early mornings to late evenings, and had chosen to spend time together even outside of those long working hours. Landon described the loss as one of the most painful of his life. Lorne Greene, who played the patriarch Ben Cartwright and served as a kind of anchor figure for the entire cast, was equally devastated. The Bonanza family had been, in many real ways, a genuine family. And families feel the loss of a member in ways that outsiders cannot fully measure. For the producers and the network, the death created an immediate and painful professional crisis as well. Bonanza had been built on 4 central characters, and one of them, arguably the most beloved, was gone. The decision was eventually made to continue the series, but the heart had gone out of it. Without Haas Cartwright, Bonanza was a different show. The ratings reflected that. The series that had once dominated Sunday nights and felt like it might run forever ended after the 1972 to 1973 season, just 1 year after Blocker's death. It is difficult not to see those two facts as deeply connected. For the fans, and there were millions of them, spread across every corner of America and large parts of the world, the death produced a grief that went beyond ordinary celebrity mourning. People did not just like Haas Cartwright. They trusted him. He represented a particular kind of goodness, a decency that felt rare even in fiction. Losing him felt like losing something real. Because, in a meaningful sense, it was. The goodness Haas embodied had come directly from the man playing him. When Dan Blocker died, so did the source. In the aftermath of Dan Blocker's death, the world waited to see how his widow would respond. Dolphia Parker Blocker had been his wife since 1952. 2 decades of marriage, 4 children, a life built deliberately and quietly in defiance of everything Hollywood expected a star's spouse to be. She had stood beside him through the rise of Bonanza. She had supported the decision to move the family to Switzerland. She had understood his need for privacy because, in many ways, she shared it completely. After he died, Dolphia faced a fork in the road that many widows of famous men have faced before her. She could step into the public conversation about her husband. She could give the interviews that reporters were certainly eager to conduct. She could become the keeper of his flame in a visible, public way, attending memorials, speaking at events, appearing in the documentaries and retrospectives that were sure to follow. There would have been no shortage of platforms available to her. Dan Blocker was too beloved, too significant a figure in American cultural life, for public interest in his story to fade quickly. She chose none of it. Dolphia stepped back from public life so completely and so deliberately that very little has ever been documented about her years following her husband's death. She focused on her children. She protected their privacy. She preserved Dan's memory not through public statements or media appearances but through the simple and dignified act of living well, continuing to be the woman he had loved and raising the children they had built together. She never remarried. She never sought the spotlight. She did not turn her grief into a performance or her husband's death into a platform. What little has been recorded about Dolphia in her later years suggests that she lived as she and Dan had always preferred, quietly, away from cameras and crowds and the relentless machinery of celebrity culture. She was, in her own way, practicing exactly the philosophy that had defined their marriage. Privacy was not a withdrawal from life. It was a form of respect for it. Dolphia Parker Blocker passed away in 2004, 32 years after her husband. She was in her mid-70s. The same near silence that had surrounded her life in those 32 years surrounded her death as well. There were no major press releases. There was no wave of celebrity tributes. The woman who had loved Dan Blocker, raised his children, and protected his legacy with uncommon grace slipped out of the world almost as quietly as she had lived in it. And that, in its own way, is its own kind of tragedy. Not because her life was sad, by all available accounts, she lived with purpose and dignity, but because the world largely did not know she was there. A woman who deserved to be remembered as far more than a footnote to her famous husband's story became, through her own deliberate choices, almost invisible to history. Dan Blocker has been gone for more than 50 years now. Bonanza still airs in syndication. Haas Cartwright still rides across the Ponderosa in reruns that younger generations sometimes discover by accident, drawn in by something they cannot quite name, a warmth, a gentleness, a sense of decency that somehow survived the decades and the distance. That quality came from the man. It was never manufactured. Dan Blocker did not construct Haas Cartwright from technical craft alone. He poured his own values, his own hard-won understanding of human suffering and human goodness, into every episode. The result was something that outlasted him. What makes his death genuinely tragic is not merely the fact that he died young, though 43 is heartbreakingly young for a man with so much still ahead of him. What makes it tragic is the specific cruelty of the circumstances. He had done everything right. He had listened to his body when it gave him trouble. He had gone to the doctors. He had submitted to a routine procedure that millions of people survive every year. He had come through the surgery. He had gone home. He had every reason to believe the worst was behind him. And then, without warning, without any final chance to say goodbye to the people he loved or to the life he had built with such quiet intentionality, he was gone. There was no dramatic final scene. No meaningful last words that anyone had the presence of mind to record. Just a man coming home from the hospital, feeling something was terribly wrong, and not surviving the evening. His wife spent the next 32 years without him. She raised their children. She lived her life. She kept her grief private and her dignity intact. And when she died, she rejoined the silence that had always suited both of them better than the noise ever could.